Hey guys, welcome back. Go ahead and dim the lights. Maybe fluff your pillow, take a sip of water, or tuck in that blanket just right. Tonight, we're taking a slow, meandering walk through one of history's most thankless, slightly ridiculous, and strangely fascinating jobs. A job that was equal parts loyal service, paranoia insurance, and walking stomach on legs. Yes. Tonight we begin with the food tasters of history. Those unlucky souls whose entire purpose was to nibble at the king's dinner, just to see if it would kill them. And if you're thinking, wow, that sounds kind of medieval, well, you're right. But also, not really. Food tasters existed long before medieval Europe, and stuck around much longer than you might imagine. Because as long as powerful people feared being poisoned, and they always did, there was someone nearby with a spoon and a very bad contract. So fluff your pillow, let your eyes get heavy, and let's float back, way back, to the first poor soul in history who had to look at a bowl of stew and think, well, if this goes badly, I won't even get dessert. Let's start in ancient Rome, because of course we are. The Romans had a food taster known as the pregustator. And if that sounds vaguely like a bad Italian appetizer, well, the job description wasn't much better. His job was literally to take the first bite of anything going into the emperor's mouth. Wine, meat, bread, figs, it all went through him first. And here's the thing. The emperors were obsessed with the idea of poison. You can't really blame them, considering the average Roman emperor's life expectancy was about the length of one good Netflix series. If they weren't stabbed, strangled, or drowned in their own fountain, they were usually poisoned by their loving wives, scheming sons, or that one friend who just looked a little too friendly. Take Emperor Claudius, for instance. You know, the one who stuttered, limped, drooled, and yet somehow ran an empire. Claudius had a food taster named Helotus. Poor Helotus. He faithfully sampled everything for years. And then, one day, Claudius's wife Agrippina decided she wanted her son Nero on the throne. She slipped Claudius some poisonous mushrooms. And despite Helotus's entire job existing to stop this exact thing, Claudius still died. Now, was Helotus in on it? Well, he lived to tell the tale and kept his job under Nero, which is pretty suspicious. Either he was very bad at detecting poison, or very good at pretending not to notice it. And that's kind of the theme of food tasters, because if your boss is the emperor and your boss's wife is glaring at you across the table, do you really want to spit out the mushroom and yell, poison? Or do you just shrug, swallow, and hope for a promotion? Let's drift over to another empire. Ancient China. Chinese emperors were legendarily paranoid about being poisoned. Sometimes, they didn't trust anyone to taste their food. Instead, they made an entire kitchen of eunuchs prepare meals in secret. Imagine a whole palace staff of anxious, high-pitched men running around with ladles, all terrified that if the emperor so much as burped, they'd all be executed. But when tasters were used, it got theatrical. Meals were divided into dozens of dishes, sometimes served in identical sets, so nobody could know which one was for the emperor until the very last second. That way, a poisoner couldn't just slip something in ahead of time. and the tasters had to move quickly, sampling each dish in front of the emperor before it was served. So picture it. You're a court official. You're hungry. The emperor has a steaming plate of dumplings, and you get to bite the corner off each one, chew slowly, and then hand it back. If you don't collapse on the floor, the emperor digs in. Not exactly a 5-star dining experience. Now, let's glide forward in time to medieval Europe. Because if there's one thing medieval kings were good at, it was paranoia. They had testers for their testers, and sometimes entire rituals around eating. The royal table was a performance. Take the English kings. They had the official position of the king's taster, sometimes called the juror of the king's chamber. Very fancy title for a guy who basically got to nibble on roast goose and hope it didn't contain arsenic. But the English court loved ceremony. Meals were presented like religious rituals. A knight or noble might carry in a golden dish a bow and present it to the taster. The taster would carefully cut a slice, chew slowly, and then, still alive, nod and step aside. All while dozens of courtiers watched in silence. It was like dinner theatre, only with the added suspense of possible homicide. And you know, sometimes the tasters themselves weren't exactly reliable. Jump over to Renaissance Italy. Poison there was basically an art form. Families like the Borgias turned it into a side hustle. Popes were suspected of poisoning cardinals. Cardinals suspected popes, and everyone suspected the cook. Food tasters in Italy had to be incredibly careful, but also incredibly corruptible. There are records of tasters being bribed to not notice things, or conveniently taking a very small taste that wouldn't show effects right away. That way, the poison would still do its job, just a little later. Because here's the irony. Food tasters were supposed to be a guarantee, but really, they were just another link in the chain of paranoia. If anything, their existence proved how untrustworthy everyone else was. Now, drifting gently into the 16th century, let's talk about Mary, Queen of Scots. She was famous for her tragic life, her dramatic hair, and her endless plots against Elizabeth I. Mary was paranoid too, and for good reason. She had a personal food taster who sampled everything. But here's the twist. Mary was eventually executed not by poison, but by axe, which, unfortunately, no amount of food tasting was going to prevent. Elizabeth I herself was cautious too. She had an entire staff of servants dedicated to food safety, and she famously distrusted silverware given as gifts, because poisoned utensils were apparently a thing. Imagine getting a beautiful golden fork for Christmas, only to think, this is probably murder in disguise. Floating eastward again, let's pause in Russia. Because of course the Russian Tsars had food tasters. Tsar Nicholas II, the last Romanov, had a man named Spiridon Putin. Yes, distant relative of that Putin. Spiridon worked as a chef and taster for the Romanovs, and later for Soviet leaders including Lenin and Stalin, which means this man survived tasting food for both Nicholas II and Joseph Stalin. If you want proof that food tasters were maybe blessed with some cosmic luck, Spiridon is Exhibit A. And we can't forget the most famous modern example, Adolf Hitler. Yes, he had food tasters too. Toward the end of the war, as Hitler hid away in his bunker, he was terrified of assassination by poison. He had a group of 15 young women from the surrounding area taste his meals. One of them, Margot Volk, survived the war and later told her story. Every day, she and the others would be served Hitler's vegetarian meals. They'd take cautious bites, wait for any sign of illness, and then, if nothing happened, the dishes were sent to Hitler. Margot recalled being terrified every single time, certain that one day she'd eat her last bite, and yet she lived into her 90s. So yes, food tasters didn't disappear with the Middle Ages. They lingered on right into the 20th century. But let's slow down here. Because beyond all the famous emperors, kings, and dictators, think about the tasters themselves. These were usually servants, slaves, or lower-ranking courtiers. People with no real choice. They lived in constant suspense, never sure if the next meal would be their last. And even when they survived, they weren't celebrated heroes. Nobody wrote ballads about the guy who sampled the soup and didn't die. They were invisible, expendable, and utterly necessary. The perfect metaphor for the paranoia of power. So tonight, as we drift through their stories, we'll meet more of these unlucky taste testers. We'll see emperors who trusted them, queens who ignored them, and poisons that slipped past anyway. And maybe, just maybe, we'll get a small taste ourselves of how fear and food have always been linked, all the way up to the royal table. But for now, let's let that settle. Take a slow breath, and when you're ready, we'll float forward to the next royal disaster in dining. All right? We're still tucked in, still cozy. And as promised, we're wading deeper into this strange career path, being the unlucky fork in the road between a king's stomach and a king's coffin. So let's ease back into ancient Rome for just a moment. Because if there was ever a civilization that treated paranoia like a national sport, it was the Romans. We already met Claudius and his suspicious mushroom night. But let's not forget his successors. Nero, yes, the same Nero who fiddled while Rome burned, also had food tasters. Did it help him? Not really. Nero's end came by his own hand, or at least by guiding someone else's hand. You could say his taster was technically successful. The guy never keeled over from Nero's dinner plate. That's about as close to winning as the job ever got. And then there was Commodus. The emperor was so deranged that later writers literally turned him into a villain in Gladiator. Commodus didn't just worry about poison. He worried about basically everything. But he still dined with tasters, because nothing says relaxing evening meal like having someone pre-chew your roast pork in case it's laced with arsenic. But paranoia wasn't exclusive to emperors. Let's wander over to Byzantium, the eastern half of the empire, where emperors were even more dramatic about their dining habits. Byzantine court records show layers upon layers of checks before food ever touched the imperial lips. Dishes were sealed, carried in procession, unlocked in front of guards, sniffed, sliced, and tasted. By the time the emperor actually got to eat, dinner was colder than my coffee after 3 reheats. And still, they worried, which is fair. Because when your crown sits on the chopping block of politics, a little oregano mixed with arsenic could be the end of your dynasty. Now, let's float back into medieval England. Because English kings didn't just have tasters, they had ritualized tasters. Whole jobs are built around the concept of tasting things in order. Imagine applying for a position in the royal household and your title becomes Yeoman of the Mouth. Not glamorous, but at least it came with a uniform. One fun case is King John, the guy best remembered for being bullied into signing Magna Carta in 1215. Chroniclers claimed that John died from poison. Convenient, right? But others said it was just a nasty case of dysentery from bad peaches, which honestly sounds more believable. And yet, he had tasters, meaning either they failed or peaches weren't part of the official taste test menu. Maybe they figured fruit was safe. Spoiler, it was not. Speaking of fruit, let's drift into France. French kings had a dining ritual called the Grand Couvert. This was basically dinner, performed as theatre. In front of courtiers, everything was paraded out, tasted ceremonially, and then the king got to nibble, while everyone else watched like it was the hottest Netflix premiere. Louis XIV, the Sun King himself, had his meals inspected and tasted in front of him. But here's the thing. Louis ate so much that it would have been practically impossible for tasters to test everything. His breakfast alone could involve multiple meats, pastries, soups, and gallons of hot chocolate. By the time tasters made it through half, Louis was already diving into the other half. If anyone wanted to poison him, they could have just gone with dessert. But Louis didn't die of poison. He died slowly, painfully, of gangrene, which no taster could fix. Let's drift south into Italy again. Because if there's one family who really should have had tasters on speed dial, it was the Medici. Banking tycoons turned dukes, with a flair for art, fashion, and the occasional suspicious death. Take Lorenzo de' Medici, Lorenzo the Magnificent. He survived an assassination attempt at Mass, where his brother Giuliano was killed, not by poison, but by stabbing. See, poison is dramatic, but sometimes a plain old knife gets the job done faster. And yet, Lorenzo's descendants still feared poison enough to employ official tasters. You'd think with all that wealth, they could have invested in an early poison detection kit. But no, they just relied on terrified servants with taste buds. Now, let's gently wander into the Ottoman Empire. The sultans of Istanbul were some of the most paranoid rulers in history, and for good reason. The palace politics of Topkapi were ruthless. Brothers were strangled, advisors executed, and poison was always an option. Ottoman sultans had an official taster known as the Katil Ağası, the Chief of Spoon. Yes, that was a real title. The Chief of Spoon would sample dishes, sip from the coffee, and present the meal only after surviving a few bites. And coffee, by the way, was an obsession. Imagine being the guy who had to take the first sip of the Sultan's steaming Turkish coffee, knowing one bad bean could send you into eternal sleep. Make Starbucks seem a lot less stressful. And now, let's touch on one of my favorite odd cases. Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon, the man who crowned himself emperor, didn't trust anyone else to put a crown on his head. Of course, he had food tasters. His cook, Dunant, was responsible for both preparing and tasting. Napoleon wasn't even especially paranoid about poison. He was just particular. He liked simple meals, often chicken or soup, but even those got the test treatment. Ironically, when Napoleon died on St. Helena, people debated whether it was stomach cancer or poison. His hair samples later revealed traces of arsenic. So either he was poisoned slowly, or his wallpaper was laced with arsenic dye, which was a tragically stylish way to die. In any case, his taster didn't save him. And here's a fun, modern jump. The Pope. Yes, the Pope technically still has food tasters. Vatican meals for the pontiff are overseen and sampled by trusted staff. And historically, popes needed it. Renaissance popes were constantly accused of poisoning rivals and being poisoned themselves. Pope Clement VII, for instance, was rumored to have been poisoned with mushrooms. Mushrooms really had a bad reputation. Honestly, I wouldn't trust a mushroom either. They're either delicious or deadly, and often it's a coin toss. Now, before we drift further, let's pause and think about the irony here. The whole purpose of a food taster was reassurance, to calm the royal nerves, to make dinner less stressful. And yet, it never really worked. Emperors still died, kings still suspected their cooks, and queens still glared across the table. The taster was a human placebo, a little bite of comfort, proof that paranoia could be outsourced to someone else's stomach. And in a way, isn't that the most royal thing ever? Delegating even your fear of death to a servant. So let's float on, slowly, into more examples. More kings, queens, and unlucky mouthpieces who chewed their way through history. And as we drift, remember, if you ever feel underappreciated at your job, at least your boss isn't literally waiting to see if your lunch kills you. Alright, still cozy? Good. Because we're drifting now into one of history's most infamous dynasties. A family tree so tangled, it looked less like a tree and more like a wilted houseplant. Yes, the Habsburgs. And of course, if you're going to inbreed your way into looking like a melted wax statue, you're also going to worry constantly about poison. Because nothing says I'm unpopular quite like ruling half of Europe and marrying your own cousins at the same time. Let's start with Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor. Charles ruled a chunk of the world so big, maps had to squish it in. Spain, Austria, the Netherlands, bits of Italy, and all those new lands being claimed in the Americas. With that much territory, you can imagine how many people wanted him dead. Pretty much everyone with a dagger. Charles dined with elaborate ritual. Meals were prepared, sealed, and presented under heavy guard. And yes, every dish was tasted before it got anywhere near him, which honestly sounds exhausting. Imagine just wanting a quick sandwich, but you have to wait for half a dozen servants to bow, sniff, slice, nibble, and nod before you can bite. By the time the bread hit his plate, it was probably stale. But did it save him? Well, not really. Charles eventually retired from ruling, grew sick, and spent his final years eating too much rich food. He basically poisoned himself with gout. Proof that sometimes the enemy isn't arsenic, it's just overeating. Now glide forward to Philip II of Spain. son of Charles, famous for bankrupting Spain multiple times, sending out the Spanish Armada, and being generally as cheerful as a damp sock. Philip's court was rigid and ceremonial. Every meal had an army of servants involved, including tasters. The irony is that Philip himself was a hypochondriac. He worried about everything: illness, sin, enemies, even the weather. So food tasting didn't exactly relax him. If anything, it gave him more time to stew about death while watching someone else chew. And speaking of chewing, Philip was so stiff and formal, it's said he sometimes ate behind a curtain, just so courtiers couldn't see his chewing face. Imagine being the taster, forced to sample soup in front of everyone, while the king slurped in private like some divine toddler. But the Habsburgs really hit peak paranoia with Charles II of Spain. Ah yes, Charles the Bewitched. A man so inbred, his family tree didn't branch, it just looped. Charles had that infamous Habsburg jaw, so pronounced that he could barely chew. He was sickly, infertile, and generally a tragic mashup of bad genetics. Naturally, when a king like this struggles to walk, talk, or eat without help, people start whispering about curses and witchcraft. Charles became convinced he was under constant supernatural attack. And of course, food was suspect number one. He employed multiple tasters, priests, and even exorcists to cleanse his meals. Imagine a royal dinner where not only is someone nibbling your bread roll, but another guy is sprinkling holy water on it while mumbling Latin. Did it work? Not really. Charles still wasted away. His death was blamed on sorcery, but the real poison was centuries of cousin marriage. Now let's gently float over to the Tudors in England, because no one loved a paranoid banquet quite like Henry VIII. Henry had an official post called the Groom of the Stool. Yes, the man in charge of his bathroom needs. But along with that glamorous role, Henry also had food tasters. Because of course he did. The man had 6 wives, endless enemies, and more paranoia than sense. Meals were inspected, locked, and presented in a ceremony. Tasters sampled each dish, but Henry was still suspicious. Sometimes he refused meals altogether, convinced they were laced. Other times, he overindulged so badly that poison would have been redundant. His own diet gave him ulcers, obesity, and eventually gout so bad he had to be wheeled around. Ironically, the biggest threat to Henry wasn't a poison goblet. It was his own kitchen producing an all-meat, all-ale menu. And then there's Elizabeth I. If Henry was paranoid, Elizabeth was downright cautious. She lived in a world of plots, Catholic assassins, rival queens, and even her own courtiers. Every dish was tested, every utensil was checked, and she still worried. Elizabeth was known to refuse food if she suspected anything odd. Some accounts say she even had entire meals discarded because she didn't like the look of them. Imagine being the taster who already risked your life on a stew, only to have the queen wrinkle her nose and send it away. Risk without reward. And yet, Elizabeth survived into old age. Not from the skill of her tasters necessarily, but because she was just plain stubborn. Now, let's float across to France again. The Bourbons, much like the Habsburgs, leaned heavily on ritual. Louis XV and Louis XVI dined with food tasters. But here's the kicker. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette weren't poisoned. They were guillotined, which, sadly for the tasters, was way outside their job description. And Marie Antoinette herself, she lived in such luxury that she hardly touched half the meals prepared for her. Imagine being a taster, nervously chewing elaborate pastries, only to watch the Queen take one polite nibble and move on. Risking your life for crumbs. Let's float east again to Japan, because Japanese emperors too had official tasters. Poison in Japanese courts was less common than in Europe, but the paranoia was still there. Meals for the shogun and emperor were tested, presented with ritual, and often cooked in separate kitchens under guard. The entire idea was to make sure no outsider could meddle. The irony, of course, is that in Japanese history, assassinations were far more likely to involve swords than soup. If someone wanted you dead, they weren't sneaking powder into your miso. They were charging into your palace with a katana. Still, the tasters remained, because ritual is as important as reality. And drifting into more recent times, let's not forget Joseph Stalin. Yes, Uncle Joe had food tasters. He was famously paranoid. Shocking, I know. His cook and staff tasted every dish before it reached him. And yet Stalin still managed to give himself chronic stomach problems because he ate absurdly rich food late at night. Georgian banquets, heavy on wine and garlic, probably did more damage than any assassin could. So once again, tasters were there more for show than safety. Stalin didn't die from poison. He died from a stroke, possibly while his staff debated whether or not to check on him, which tells you everything you need to know about loyalty in the Kremlin. So what do we see here? From the Habsburgs to the Tudors to Stalin, tasters were everywhere. And yet, royals still died in droves of disease, accidents, knives, axes, revolutions, and their own terrible diets. The tasters may have saved a few lives, but more often, they were just another cog in the theatre of power. Proof that rulers lived in constant fear, and proof that fear can't really be outsourced. So as we tuck ourselves deeper into this sleepy little history, let's keep drifting, because there are still more forgotten tasters, more suspicious banquets, and more royal stomachaches waiting ahead. So far, we've drifted past ancient Persia and Rome. We've sighed at medieval banquets, and we've floated gently through the Renaissance buffet line. But royal paranoia was by no means a medieval problem alone. Oh no, poison, and therefore the professional taste testing industry, remained alive and well into the early modern period. Because kings never stopped fearing that their cousin, their advisor, or frankly, their own children, might slip something nasty into the soup. Take the French court in the 16th and 17th centuries. Ah, France, where the powdered wigs were high, the morals were low, and the paranoia was somewhere in between. Catherine de' Medici, of course, gets blamed for introducing poison as a fashionable accessory in France, which, to be fair, she was Italian, and Italians had been earning their rather unfair reputation for the art of poison for centuries. Small vials of arsenic were practically a wedding favour in Renaissance Florence. At Catherine's court, the kitchen was almost as fortified as the royal treasury. Every dish destined for the queen went through multiple hands and at least one unfortunate taster. We don't often know their names, but they were there, nibbling on roasted capons and custard pies while silently calculating their odds of making it to dessert. Imagine being told you'd spend your life at the royal table, only to realize it was in the same way a canary gets to spend life in a coal mine. Now skip forward a century or two. By the time Louis XIV waddled onto the throne, the so-called Sun King, his daily meals were an entire opera. The king liked to eat in front of an audience, with dozens of nobles fawning and watching him chew. Naturally, poison paranoia was through the roof. At Versailles, the food tasting system was so bureaucratic, it could have doubled as a ministry. Each course was checked by appointed servants. The king's dishes were carried in on silver trays, already pre-nibbled by the tasters, just in case one ambitious duke wanted to spice up politics with a little powdered mercury. And yet, the irony is, poisoning almost never happened. Oh, the rumors were constant, yes, but actual cases? Rare. Most royals died of gout, smallpox, or the sheer weight of their own arteries giving up. Still, paranoia kept the food tasters employed, which is probably the single biggest historical example of job security built entirely on imaginary threats. But France was not alone in its obsession. Over in Russia, the Tsars were equally suspicious. And for good reason. Russian court politics made Versailles look like a kindergarten tea party. Ivan the Terrible, for instance, was a man who distrusted pretty much everyone. Family, advisors, clergy. Nobody was safe. He did indeed keep food tasters, though tasting in Russia could involve drinking the Tsar's wine in front of him, while everyone nervously counted to 10. The poor tasters probably spent more time tipsy than they did alive. By the 18th century, the practice was widespread enough that food tasting had become a symbol of status. If your ruler had a professional poison detector sitting by the soup pot, it meant you'd really made it. Ordinary nobles, of course, had to settle for the old-fashioned method of eating dinner and simply hoping for the best. Let's glide for a moment to Britain, though. English monarchs also flirted with the poison panic, but the system there often looked more like ceremonial theatre than practical defense. For coronations and state banquets, an official taster sometimes sampled dishes. But in practice, the role was largely decorative, like the guy with a feathered hat who announces the king's arrival. Poison paranoia in England was less institutionalized than in France or Russia, though it never disappeared completely. And because humans are endlessly weird, the tradition even survived into surprisingly modern times. In the 20th century, some heads of state still kept tasters. Most famously, Adolf Hitler had an entire squad of them. He was so paranoid about poisoning that a group of women in East Prussia were forced to eat his meals before he did. They weren't volunteers, of course. They were essentially conscripted into taste-testing duty, living every day with the delightful knowledge that they might be dead by dessert. So yes, the tradition limped on. And through all these centuries, food tasters remained the invisible shadows at royal tables. They weren't knights or generals. They weren't remembered with statues or epic poems. They were the background figures, nibbling nervously, hoping today wasn't the day. And what's more relaxing than realizing that in history, some people's entire careers amounted to, please eat this chicken leg so the king won't die first. Let's drift forward now into the later centuries, where tasters became less about poison and more about performance. By the 19th century, the golden age of poisoning at court was, well, pretty much over. Not because people suddenly got nicer, of course. It's just that science had improved enough that slipping arsenic into a cup of wine wasn't as easy to get away with. Medical examiners had started figuring things out, and rulers had better ways of being assassinated, like gunpowder or revolutions. Much tidier than messing with soup. But still, the food taster lingered. By now, the job had become less about survival and more about ritual. Picture a royal banquet in late Victorian England. The menu is 10 courses long. The candles are flickering. The air smells faintly of roast pheasant. And somewhere at the side table, an official dips into the gravy first, just for form's sake. Nobody really expects them to keel over, but the act itself is comforting. Like buckling your seatbelt on a plane, even when you know statistically it probably won't matter. This is where we see the role of tasters shift into pure theatre. In Britain, the Grand Carver and Chief Cupbearer still technically existed, though by the 1800s, they were basically just men in fancy tights waving knives around ceremonially. Food tasting was folded into these traditions, a faint echo of the days when Henry VIII genuinely thought his stew might be laced with powdered emeralds. Meanwhile, in Japan, the imperial household kept its own set of food guardians. Even in the 20th century, emperors like Hirohito had their meals sampled before reaching the table. And, as always, it wasn't the emperor who had to swallow the first bite of raw fish. It was some faceless court official who probably wondered every single day whether the sashimi would be his last. And then, as we brushed on earlier, came one of the strangest modern revivals, Hitler's tasters. Now, Hitler was many things, but relaxed was not one of them. He lived in constant paranoia that the Allies, or even his own circle, would poison him. So at his East Prussian hideout, the Wolf's Lair, a group of 15 young women was drafted to taste his meals. Each day, the cooks would bring out vegetarian dishes, because yes, Hitler had decided meat was off the table for him, and the women would sample them before the Führer touched a fork. One of these women, Margot Volk, later gave testimony about her experience. She recalled sitting with the others, eating the carefully prepared meals and waiting in terror for that first cramp or choke. She survived the war, but others weren't so lucky. When the Soviets advanced, many of the tasters were executed. Margot escaped only by chance. It's a grim reminder that even in the 20th century, the food taster's job was still very much life and death. But even in less dictatorial contexts, echoes of food tasting survived. During World War II, Winston Churchill also travelled with his own culinary guards. Not because anyone seriously thought his Yorkshire pudding was laced with cyanide, but because caution was considered patriotic. If the Prime Minister went down with food poisoning in the middle of the Blitz, it would have been a bad look for morale. Fast forward a bit more. And we see similar roles pop up in modern state visits. When world leaders dine together, their kitchens are often heavily guarded, and occasionally food tasters still appear. Not so much a job title anymore as a background duty of security staff. Imagine joining the Secret Service and finding out your big assignment isn't taking a bullet. It's nibbling at the president's mashed potatoes. It's ceremonial, it's cautious, and it's mostly for show. But it's also one of those little relics of history that refuses to die completely because of the human instinct to mistrust dinner. Eternal. So by the time we reach the present, the royal food taster has become less a doomed canary and more a living reminder of just how paranoid power can make people. The job still exists in fragments, hidden in the kitchens of presidents, shadowed in the banquet halls of monarchies, but it's almost never talked about, which is perhaps fitting. After all, the tasters were always meant to be invisible. If they did their job right, no one noticed them at all. And yet, here we are, spending an hour of our lives whispering about them, which, in its own sleepy way, is probably more attention than they ever got while alive. The royal food taster, in the end, was never just about food. It was about trust, or the lack of it. When you're a king or a queen, people pretend to love you. They bow, they flatter, they scribble your name in illuminated manuscripts. But under all that polite applause, you know someone would absolutely slip ground up arsenic into your broth if given the chance. And that knowledge doesn't exactly make dinner feel like a warm family gathering. That's why tasters thrived for centuries. They were living proof of paranoia dressed up as etiquette. Eating before the monarch wasn't just protection, it was theatre. It told everyone in the room, this ruler is important enough that even their stew requires a bodyguard. Which is both impressive and sad, if you think about it. The paranoia wasn't unfounded, of course. Poison was the great invisible equalizer. A stable boy with access to the spice rack could theoretically do what an army couldn't. From the Borgia's notorious Cantarella to Byzantine cupbearers accused of betrayal, history is full of rulers who died mysteriously mid-meal. The taster was a defense mechanism, but also a constant reminder that death might be hiding in the soup. There's a curious irony here. The more powerful a ruler became, the less safe they felt. A farmer eating porridge on a wooden spoon didn't need a taster. The king with a golden goblet did. And so, with every elevation of status, you were also elevated into new forms of anxiety. Imagine being crowned emperor only to realize it also came with chronic indigestion and the daily sight of some poor servant poking at your lamb chops first. And then there's the ritual side. Humans love ceremony. We like our traditions, even if they no longer make sense. That's why even in the 19th century, long after poison had fallen out of fashion, courts kept their official tasters or cupbearers around. They weren't protecting anyone. They were just playing out the shadow of an old fear, the same way we still knock on wood or cross our fingers. It's superstition dressed up as protocol. By the modern age, food tasting became part of the larger theatre of state security. The idea was no longer that your cook was secretly slipping hemlock into the pudding. It was that foreign agents or political enemies might try something more elaborate. which is why even today, kitchens in the White House or the Élysée Palace are under tight watch. You don't see the tasters, but they're there. Sometimes in the form of security personnel, sometimes just by locking down the food supply chain. So the royal taster has lingered into the 21st century, not as the heroic martyr they once were, but as a quiet background figure. Someone is checking the sushi before the diplomat takes a bite. Someone is pretending to nibble the cheese platter just to make the room feel a little calmer. They're not front and center anymore, but the ghost of their role hovers at every state dinner. And maybe that's the lesson here. Power and paranoia are inseparable dinner companions. If you want to sit at the head of the table, you also have to live with the constant suspicion that someone might salt your bread with more than just salt. It's a lonely way to dine. But then again, being royal was never really about comfort. It was about appearance, ritual, and keeping up the image, even if the image came with a side of arsenic. So next time you tuck into your own plate of food, consider how luxurious it is to simply eat without thinking of poison. No tasters, no theatrics, no shadow of betrayal in your mashed potatoes. Just food. A little boring maybe. But in history, boredom was the real luxury.